Joshua chapter 11, the Northern Campaign. Now, what we have in this chapter is a description of Joshua's campaign against northern Canaan. And actually, we need to keep in mind, this was God's campaign. He used the Israelites to judge the iniquity of the Canaanites, just as later on he used the nation of Assyria to judge the northern kingdom of Israel. And after that, he used Babylon to judge Judah. Verse 1, And then it came about, when Jabin, king of Hazor, heard of it, that he sent to Jobab, king of Madon, and to the king of Shimron, and to the king of Achshaph, and to the kings who are of the north in the hill country, and in the Arabah, south of Kinneroth, and in the lowland, and on the heights of Dor on the west, to the Canaanite on the east and on the west, and the Amorite, and the Hittite, and the Perizzite, and the Jebusite in the hill country, and the Hivite at the foot of Hermon, in the land of Mizpah. They came out, they and all their armies with them, as many people as the sand that is on the seashore, with very many horses and chariots. So all of these kings, having agreed to meet, came and encamped together at the waters of Merom to fight against Israel. Let's take a look at this. Jabin is not the king's name, it's a title, and it was actually found to be the name of a dynasty. Several rulers in succession used the name Jabin. Hazor is the focal point here. It was a large city and fortress located on the Great Trunk Road, which led down through the middle of Canaan. And now they say that it is the single largest archaeological site in modern-day Israel, even dwarfing such areas as Megiddo and David's Jerusalem. Madon is west of the Sea of Galilee. Shimron is west of Nazareth. Kinneroth, Sea of Galilee, known as Gennesaret in the New Testament. You can look at Matthew 14:34 for that. Land of Mizpah, thought to be west of Mount Hermon. Now, the waters of Merom, some say this was in the Hula Valley, but it's more likely to be southwest of there. There's a present-day city now that is in a valley with a stream running through it, and we want to look at that in more detail. Now, I want to stop for a moment. You have that phrase, as many people as the sand that is on the seashore. Okay, what is that? That was just a generic saying about there was a whole lot of whatever the topic was. In this case, people, horses, and chariots. We use kind of a slang term today in common speech when we want to say something as there's a whole lot of something, that we say, oh, there was a bazillion of them. Okay, we have several maps. This will be the first. First, you look, you see at the bottom, center, Dead Sea. You go up the Jordan River to the Sea of Galilee. You see Kinnereth. That was a community there, but the whole Sea of Galilee was referred to that at times. Hazor, you see the location. You look sort of west, maybe southwest, you see the name Merom. And you can see some dotted lines there showing there were some small, sometimes seasonal streams or wadis that came from there. North from there, you see Dan, and that light spot is Mount Hermon. And to the west of that, would be kind of north of Dan, would have been where land of Mizpah was. And just while we're looking at this, you see back to, let's say, Sea of Galilee, you see the green line. That's the Great Trunk Road. And it goes down southwest to Megiddo. Now, you'll notice there's sort of a kink in that road there, and a spot, a little lighter spot here on our map, right at that bend in that green line. That's Nazareth. So, and actually that little lump of brown there, that is Nazareth. Nazareth is a town that sits in a bowl of a mountaintop. So it's actually in a depression with a range of the edges of the mountain all around it. So now let's move to the next slide. Now here we have an aerial photograph from our spaceship flying about 20 miles above north central Israel here. This is modern day aerial photograph, fairly recent, in the 2000s. And you have near where it says Google Earth, you have the north part of the Sea of Galilee. And if we go kind of a little bit west of straight north up there, you'll see the name, the red dot, and the name Hatzor Hagalit. All right, that's Hazor, also known as Hatzor. Now, if you go west from there, you see a town named Meron. Now, that is Merom. Modern day, they've changed it, and it ends with an N. And if you look around it and to the south, you see it's kind of a darker area. There is a stream or a small river that flows southeast in the general direction of the Sea of Galilee. And it's in that area is where all of these kings with their forces gathered. They didn't gather right at Hazor or Hatzor. They gathered in the area of Meron. There's a more open area, and besides, the king of Hazor didn't want the battle to go right there in his front yard. He wanted to have the battle go on somewhere else. Okay, another map. Here we have the northern campaign with where the various forces came from. Now, again, to get us oriented, we have Jericho and the Dead Sea at the bottom. You have the Sea of Galilee near the middle. Above it is Hazor. Now, this particular map, the authors of the article that was included with it actually put Merom up further north. And whereas what seems a better position is where you see that strong red arrow, is where kind of in the middle of that arrow pointing downward would be where Merom is. But you notice the red lines, the red ending with arrows, they're all pointing to a central location where the Canaanite forces gathered. Now you'll notice coming from down south, a line drawn up in blue from Jericho shows the forces of Israel moving north. Now this line is not correct. It shows it's starting from the first Gilgal. We need to remember there was more than one, even two or three Gilgals over time, or more than that perhaps. So it actually started, the line should be, that blue line should be shifted over where you see the name Shiloh, not far above and a little bit to the left of Jericho, just to give us a sense of what's going on. Okay, let's read starting verse 6. Then the Lord said to Joshua, "Do not be afraid of them, for tomorrow at this time I will deliver all of them slain before Israel. You shall hamstring their horses and burn their chariots with fire." So Joshua and all the people of war with him came upon them suddenly by the waters of Merom and attacked them. The Lord delivered them into the hand of Israel, so that they defeated them and pursued them as far as Great Sidon in Mizrath-Maim in the valley of Mizpah to the east. And they struck them until no survivor was left of them. Joshua did to them as the Lord had told him. He hamstrung their horses and burned their chariots with fire. Now, what we have here, of course, the Canaanites are now bivouacked at Merom. And they're there to develop their plan of attack to move south and engage with Joshua's forces. Now, let's look at this. Simply, you see that Joshua was given only one command: hamstring the enemy horses and burn their chariots, which is aligned with God's command in Deuteronomy 17:16. Now, we see here also the Lord is encouraging Joshua. They had that failure at Ai, and then later they messed up when they made a treaty with Gibeon. And so now he's looking and you think, how does he know the huge size of the enemy forces? Well, he had scouts. all armies will try to have scouts to figure out where the enemy forces are. And so he had people up north watching all this going on. They probably reported to him the movements of all the Canaanites coming into a central location not too far away from Hazor. And so he had an idea, and reports came back saying there are a whole lot of people going there, a lot of soldiers, and they were going there with large numbers of chariots and war horses. And so this was scary. So you see here, Lord says, don't be afraid, for tomorrow at this time I will deliver all of them slain before Israel. In verse 7, we see that Joshua makes a sudden preemptive attack on the enemy, and it catches them by surprise. We could describe that in more modern terms as a blitzkrieg attack, in which you just sweep over the enemy before they have time to fully organize themselves. And it's very successful. He had used this method before during the southern campaign. But we see here, notice, the Lord delivers the enemy into the Israelites' hand. It can't give all the credit to the Israelites. It was God who was the true commander, and he is guiding it, and he delivered the enemy. And the Israelites' job was just to do what he had told them and to wipe them out. This pursuit, we see it goes as far up to the northwest as Sidon, and then west toward this Misrephoth Maim or Zarephath. The valley of Mizpah, its location is not certain, since the word Mizpah means watchtower. And obviously there were been many watchtowers all over Canaan. That was apparently somewhere to the east of Merom, and that would have put it probably on the north of up north above the Sea of Galilee, which is also getting into the foothills of Mount Hermon. And as you can imagine, if you want to have a good ability to sight out over large areas, you want to put your watchtower on a high point. And so it's logical that they would have not only a watchtower, but many up in that area to look out to the east and the south and the west, and with the Mount Hermon behind them. It makes good sense, but we can't really say with accuracy where Mizpah in this case is. Verse 10, then Joshua turned back at that time and captured Hazor and struck its king with the sword, for Hazor was the head of all these kingdoms. They struck every person who was in it with the edge of the sword, utterly destroying them. There was no one left who breathed, and he burned Hazor with fire. Joshua captured all the cities of these kings and all their kings, and he struck them with the edge of the sword and utterly destroyed them, just as Moses, the servant of the Lord, had commanded. Okay, so the Israelites then marched back and going east toward Hazor from the area of Merom and destroyed the fortress and its king. Now it's interesting, archaeological research shows that this fortress was destroyed, but the civilian city next to it didn't suffer a whole lot of damage. Everyone at Hazor was killed, just as with Ai and Jericho. So what we see, the forces of Hazor and the king had retreated back to their fort, but there were too few of them to hold off the Israelis. They had already been routed and were racing back to try to hide behind the walls of their fort, but with the Israelis hard on their trail, they probably were trying to get into it and didn't quite get the fort sealed off, because we see that the Israeli forces swept in and just as before killed everyone there. So the city sections, there were two, did not seem to have been destroyed too much. It was just the people. And what we see again here is the Canaanites had fallen to the level of Sodom and Gomorrah. Back in Genesis, Sodom and Gomorrah and the other three cities involved there had become so just decadent and wicked that God had to remove them, because they were just like a terrible disease sitting in that part of the Middle East. And so had to get rid of them, and they were destroyed. Now we see here God had given them over 400 years of the Canaanites to stop their heading down morally into the same direction, but they didn't. And so again, to protect his people, the Lord has all of Canaan, these people, destroyed. God is a judge of all of us, and he decides ultimately what's going to happen. And we have to trust him on that he is a righteous God, a perfect God. He is a God of perfect justice. He knows the lifespan and destiny of every person, either on the earth or has ever been on earth. And so he is not acting with just a temper tantrum like some skeptics say. He had to clean this out because they had so degraded themselves, only judgment was left of them. And being God and knowing their future, he also knew they would never turn to him. Let's look a little bit more at Hazor. Hazor is the only fortified city to be burned in either the southern or northern campaigns. And this city section covered about 170 acres. Now, it's not as a square or a cube, but imagine a square a little bit more than a half a mile on each side. That would have been the size of the city section. And the fortress encompassed about another 30 acres. So the total acreage, as you can see, was about 200. And this makes it the largest known archaeological site in modern day Israel. Now, archaeologists found that all the statues of their gods, so the Canaanite gods, were decapitated and their hands were cut off. So it's an interesting thing. And archaeologists say that this was a trait that was unique to the Israelites. Other nations or groups that came in and conquered may have just gotten rid of the gods, but they didn't necessarily behead them and chop their hands off. This was an interesting thing here that they were doing. Now, it parallels what we see that this destruction of idols. We see that God does this to Dagon, the Philistine fish god, in 1 Samuel 5:4, where the Canaanites now, the Philistines, have the ark, and they put it in there with their god Dagon. As you remember the story, the next day they go in, they find first Dagon is off his pedestal and lying face down in front of the ark. So they put him back up there. And the next day they come in and he's down again, but this time his head is broken off and the hands of the idol, the carved statue, were also broken off. So we see that again in the time of Samuel. So we see here that Joshua is faithfully carrying out the orders given by Moses in Exodus 23. Okay, now we find ourselves flying along in our helicopter looking down on Hazor from about 2,000 feet. You can see that by the bottom right. It tells you the eye altitude. And we're looking at the modern archaeological site of Hazor. As you see in the upper middle, it's labeled the lower city. Now that means it was a little bit lower than the fortress, because we're looking in this picture to the northwest. And then you see below that a term, the north walls. And in that dark area and below it where you see a curved line, probably produced by the archaeologists and their vehicles and such, to be able to get access to the various parts, because this was a 200-acre site. Okay, and then you can also see here where at the lower part it says upper city. That meant it was a little bit higher than the fortress area. And then you have other things. You can see where the Israelites had gotten involved. You have an Israelite wall pointed out. You have the pointer going up toward the left middle into the middle of the fortress area. It says Solomon's Wall and Gate. So you see that much later Solomon did some building in this area, long after the Canaanites were gone. And so you can see various things, Canaanite palace, but that area in the middle, the smaller area you see is the fortress, and then it has the large lower city to the northwest of it. And then kind of to the east-southeast, you have the upper city. So this is the layout of the site as we would see it now. It's interesting, I didn't think much about it at the time, but we actually, our tour that we took in 2018 with BBC took us along that highway, which you see going from left to right in the lower part of the photograph. And we was pointed out to us, and it was said, yeah, it's nice, and didn't at that time fully understand the implications of just what our guide was pointing out to us. Verse 13. However, Israel did not burn any cities that stood on their mounds, except Hazor alone, which Joshua burned. All the spoil of these cities, and the cattle, and the sons of Israel took as their plunder, but they struck every man with the edge of the sword until they had destroyed them. They left no one who breathed. Just as the Lord had commanded Moses his servant, so Moses commanded Joshua, and so Joshua did. He left nothing undone of all that the Lord had commanded Moses. So the Israelites didn't burn any of the fortified cities that were built on hilltops except for Hazor. So, okay, what about Ai? They burned that. But what that does is shows us further evidence that Ai was just a fortress or a garrison and not a city. It was specifically a military installation. Now we see here the Israelites are continuing to follow the law of first fruits by destroying all the people who were dedicated to God, and they only took the goods and livestock for themselves. Verse 16. Thus Joshua took all that land, the hill country and all the Negev, all the land of Goshen, the lowland, the Arabah, the hill country of Israel and its lowland, from Mount Halak that rises towards Seir, even as far as Baal Gad in the valley of Lebanon at the foot of Mount Hermon. And he captured all their kings and struck them down and put them to death. Joshua waged war a long time with all these kings. There was not a city which made peace with the sons of Israel except the Hivites living in Gibeon. They took them all in battle. For it was of the Lord to harden their hearts to meet Israel in battle in order that he might utterly destroy them, that they might receive no mercy, but that he might destroy them, just as the Lord had commanded Moses. So, okay, what did they get? All in the list here, the hill country, the Negev, the south region, the desert area, the land of Goshen, which is not the Egyptian Goshen. It's another area, I'm not quite sure where that is. The lowlands, toward the area of the Jordan Valley, and also toward the seacoast, the hill country of Israel and its lowland from Mount Halak, which is possibly Qasr Uzdom. It's a very noticeable salt dome. It is located wherever it is. It's in the modern country of Jordan on the east side of the Jordan River. There also are low mountains there that are made of basically chalk. So it was very visible. That's why they used it as a marker, because it stood out very white, sort of like the cliffs of Dover in England. So it's very noticeable and made a good marker point. And then you have them going to as far as Baal Gad, which is probably most likely, I think there's not a whole lot of argument here, it was Baal Hermon, or known as Panias, or we also know it as Caesarea Philippi at the foot of Mount Hermon, and you can still go there as a tourist and see all that. A long time, this war lasted about 7 years. And this includes the short-term events, which were blitzkrieg events where they wiped out people in a day or so. And then also there was a lot of cleanup. It makes me think a little bit of the cleanup of the islands in the Pacific in World War II. It took a long time. So this long time here, we also can see, we're not going to get into it here, but you study the life of Caleb, you can see he gives us some pointers in time to get this estimate. Now in verse 20, we see that God led the Canaanites to believe that they could withstand the Israelites in open battle. He actually, in a sense, encouraged them. He gave them their head to where they could get a swelled head. They got egotistic and said, we can beat these guys. We can just go out and get them. Instead of staying, the smart thing would have been to stay in their fortifications. They didn't. And that was of the God to lead them to do what they really wanted to do. God didn't force them to do it. We are not robots. He does not treat his people and unbelievers as robots. But he simply, at times, will pull out of a person those inner thoughts that they have. And so these people were thinking, we can take these guys. And he just gave them their head there to run with it, and they did, and of course they got slaughtered. And because, leaving the safety of their forts, they just basically gave themselves to Israel to be conquered. Verse 21, then Joshua came at that time and cut off the Anakim from the hill country, from Hebron, from Debir, from Anab, and from all the hill country of Judah, and all the hill country of Israel. Joshua utterly destroyed them with their cities. There were no Anakim left in the land of the sons of Israel, only in Gaza, in Gath, and in Ashdod some remained. So Joshua took the whole land according to all that the Lord had spoken to Moses. And Joshua gave it for an inheritance to Israel according to their divisions by their tribes. Thus the land had rest from war. So we see here, it took some time. They didn't just go in a day and get rid of the Anakim, but they did. They went through, and the Anakim are giants. These are not the Nephilim we see back in Genesis before the flood. That was a whole different issue. Here are just giant people, and we know them as Goliath in a famous story. And they were in Philistine territory. And it's interesting that although it went back and forth between Israel and the Philistines were never fully destroyed. They never got rid of them. All during this time, even though they got rid of the Canaanites, the Philistines were a thorn in their flesh the entire time until when they ended up going off to Babylon. So, and these were the giant people that the 12 spies saw when they went and scouted out the land, getting ready to go in. And of course, they came back with a bad report. Only Joshua and Caleb said, yeah, we can take it. Let's go. And the other 10 said, no, we're scared. They're too big for us. We need to stay out here in the desert. And so the Lord basically said, all right, you're going to stay out there until every one of you of that age, that generation, are gone. And then your children are going to be the ones who move into the promised land. And so what we have here again, this is involving, put it in a little bit different way of looking at it, a cleanup action of those Canaanites who escaped. And it took some time just to mop up where people just ran off into the hills and they had to chase them down. So it says here, Joshua took the whole land. Okay, what they did here is they got enough territory to allow each tribe to start moving into their land. The power of the Canaanites was broken, and so that they no longer had any control or dominion over the land. Now, as Moses had told Joshua that they would not be able to drive out all the Canaanites at one time, he completed all that was possible at this time. Now, this is where the Bible gets attacked at times. Skeptics will say, well, they didn't get the whole land. It's true. They have never yet gotten all the land that God had promised to Abraham. So what's going on here? I want to read in the next slide where we see the explanation of why Joshua did everything that was possible and necessary at this time according to what God had told Moses. I want us to take a look at Exodus 23, verses 20 through 33. Behold, I am going to send an angel before you to guard you along the way and to bring you into the place which I have prepared. Be on your guard before him and obey his voice. Do not be rebellious toward him, for he will not pardon your transgression, since my name is in him. But if you truly obey his voice and do all that I say, then I will be an enemy to your enemies and an adversary to your adversaries. For my angel will go before you and bring you into the land of the Amorites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Canaanites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, and I will completely destroy them. You shall not worship their gods, nor serve them, nor do according to their deeds, but you shall utterly overthrow them and break their sacred pillars in pieces. But you shall serve the Lord your God, and he will bless your bread and your water, and I will remove sickness from your midst. There shall be no one miscarrying or barren in your land. I will fulfill the numbers of your days. I will send my terror ahead of you and throw into confusion all the people among whom you come, and I will make all your enemies turn their backs to you. I will send hornets ahead of you, so that they will drive out the Hivites, the Canaanites, and the Hittites before you. I will not drive them out before you in a single year, that the land may not become desolate and the beasts of the field become too numerous for you. I will drive them out before you little by little until you become fruitful and take possession of the land. This is an amazing promise, and it would have been fulfilled had the Israelites done what they were told here. In verse 21, it's interesting. My name is in him. This shows this is God himself, the pre-incarnate Christ. Verse 23, I underline Hivites. Okay, they made a mistake there. They didn't follow the guidance of the Lord. They didn't go to him to check to see what to do when the Hivites came sneaking up on them, pretending to be from somewhere else. It turns out they were the Gibeonites. And so they messed up there. Now, the order to completely destroy all pagan idols and relics, you see in verse 24, where it says, break their sacred pillars in pieces. If you go to verse 29 and 30, he says Moses is telling them conquering Canaan will take more than just a year. It's first because of the wild animals. They had lions and probably leopards. They had bears. These are apex predators. And if you have a lot of them in the area, that can be a big problem having to get these out. And these animals don't go down easily. And also, there were a large group of Israelites. There were a large number of people. They were still too few to be able to go out over all the land. They would have been too spread out and too thin. And so this was God's statement here, and it explains that Joshua really did everything that he was told. He took the whole land in the sense of getting it set up, and then the rest of it would have to be done, as it says in verse 30, I will drive them out before you little by little. Let's summarize here. The primary goals of the conquest, described in Joshua and Judges, we have to include that book also, were to first defeat the cities of the Canaanites, we see in this chapter, the extermination of the peoples, also in this chapter, and then the acquisition of the land, which was back to Joshua, first chapter. Now, we need to keep in mind that this was not the war of the Israelites against the Canaanites. It was the Lord's war against the Amorites/Canaanites. In Genesis 15:16, we have the statement, God speaking to Abraham, but in the fourth generation, they shall come hither again. That means the Israelites, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet full. Back in Abraham's day, he didn't have them wiped out. It was another 400 and something years before the Israelites coming back go in and they cleaned them out. It's interesting. This also, if you think about it, shows that God knows the future explicitly, exactly, precisely, because he's not trapped in time. He created time, so he can move about in it, so to speak. Now, we don't understand this. We live in time. We're trapped in time. So we can only use our language to describe something about God that he can do that we have no conception of. But it does show this. Our God is a big God. So God was going to be in control of the conquest as long as the Israelites obeyed his commands, which we just read. He caused the Canaanites to abandon the safety of their fortification. They got big egos and they decided they could take them and meet the Israelites in open battle, which in strategic terms and tactical terms as well, that was a bad idea. Also, we find going into our future, we see that God will use this process again someday when he leads the armies of Gog to destruction when they try to invade Israel. He leads Gog about and makes him do what he does in order, and it actually weakens him, and it causes the failure of that attack on Israel someday yet ahead of us. Whenever the Israelites sought God's guidance, he gave it. But when they did not do this, they failed. We have the examples of Ai and Gibeon. And the law or rule of first fruits is seen again in the way that Hazor is destroyed. God received the people, horses, and chariots, and the Israelites gained the rest of the spoil. I like to say God gets the glory if we do what he says. He gets the glory, but we get the blessing. So why did God command the horses to be hamstrung and the chariots to be burned? One, so the enemy would be deprived of their major weapons, which is their version of armor in those days, and to keep the Israelites from getting a swelled head. If they decided to take them and use them, they get the idea, we're good, we don't need God's guidance anymore, we can do it ourselves. And God had also declared a ban, a harem, on them. Moreover, he shall not multiply horses for himself, speaking of the future king of Israel, nor shall he cause the people to return to Egypt to multiply horses, since the Lord has said to you, you shall never again return that way. That's Deuteronomy 17:16. The Israelites gained enough land to allow each tribe to start moving into their territory. However, they never gained all of it because they did not follow God's guidance. Instead, as we read through the Old Testament, we see that they made some gains only to lose ground when they turned away from God. When they turned back to him, they gained. When they turned away, they lost. Their ongoing disobedience to the Lord over the centuries blocked them from ever gaining all that had been promised to Abraham in Genesis chapter 15. They could have had land going east as far as the Euphrates River, and expansion in other directions as well, but they never got it, and they haven't yet received that. Joshua did complete all that Moses, and actually it's the Lord, told him to do. It was not his job to lead the individual tribes into their land. That was their own responsibility. Further, the Lord had said that the Israelites would need to take some time conquering all the rest of the land, that all the way to Euphrates, because they would spread themselves too thin otherwise. They needed to grow as a people in numbers so they'd have enough people around to be able to hold the land. So now, what we have next going into chapter 12 and further is we find out just what the individual tribes do and what their boundaries are as they move forward as individual units now spreading and taking their way out through this new land of promise.